Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we meet again on the air in the program Man and Nature. And before we proceed with this week's discussion, let us briefly recap what we discussed last week with Dr. Raihan Ismail, Senior Lecturer, Program for Applied Sciences and Islamic Studies, Academy of Islamic Studies, University Malaya. The topic that we discussed was agriculture and climate change. During our discussion, Dr. Raihan highlighted the complex relationship between agriculture and climate change, where agricultural activities contribute towards the release of greenhouse gases that result in climate change, and climate change, on the other hand, impacts on the agricultural sector. To pick up from last week, in this week's discussion, we will be focusing on the greenhouse gases. Alhamdulillah, I am happy to introduce our guest this week, Dr. Hani Farzana binti Hizadin, who is Senior Lecturer, Department of Chemical Engineering, Faculty of Engineering, University Malaya. She holds a Master of Engineering from the University of Manchester and PhD from University Malaya. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Hani.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you for coming to Man and Nature.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Doctor, our topic is understanding carbon emissions in our daily activities.
Yes.
Perhaps to start off with, why is it widely believed that human activities are the major cause of climate change?
All right. Okay. Yes. To start off, when I wasn't quite aware of the how my daily activities can impact the climate change and how much carbon dioxide emission do I contribute in my daily life, I used to think that this carbon dioxide emission is due to the industry, the big players, the energy sector, the industrial processes, the factories, and also the cement factories. I think if we read on the internet, on the literature, we know that these are the sectors that are emitting the most CO2. However, if we reflect on ourselves, who are those industries serving? Why are they producing so much energy and thus so much CO2? It's because to serve us, the human beings, we need the energy. We are the ones who demand the energy on a continuous supply, uninterrupted supply, and thus the amount of CO2 released to the environment. And also, it is widely believed that human beings are the major contributors of the CO2 emission because of our demands, our lifestyle, the choices that we make, and these impact the energy demand. So whenever we require energy, that will definitely increase in the CO2 emission. And CO2 emission is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, which will trap the heat in the Earth's atmosphere. So I think this is also quite widely known how CO2 and other greenhouse gases causes the heat trap in the atmosphere and thus increase the temperature of the Earth, and that leads to climate change. So like it or not, as human beings, we cannot think that our daily activities do not contribute to CO2 emission.
Right. So I think the fact that we are consumers leads to industries trying to provide their products and services to us, and this is primarily the main cause of emission of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide.
Yes, just think about like when we do our daily activities from the moment we wake up in the morning. So we what do we do? So we go to the toilet, for example. Okay, so we open the tap water. So the water that we use underwent treatment and processing. And that treatment and processing requires energy. And how is it being transported to our houses? So it's not just water. Whenever we open the tap water, there are some CO2 release as an effect. And then the product that we use, the toothpaste, the shower gel, so these daily products, almost everything that we see and use every day involves some sort of mass consumption and mass production. And whenever mass production is involved, there are factories. So these factories, if we know from engineering perspective, machines, they need energy to run. So where do we get the energy from? It's from electricity. So the electricity, it depends, the source of electricity. If it's green, then it doesn't emit so much CO2. But typically, conventionally, and in our country, Malaysia also, we use fossil fuel. to provide electricity. So these fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas, they are carbon-based fuel. So this carbon-based, when we burn them to produce energy, they will emit CO2. So like it or not, all these processes, the machines that need energy, energy comes from electricity, electricity comes from fossil fuel, and fossil fuel produce CO2. So those are the contributors of CO2 emission just by our mere existence and fulfilling our needs. So that's why we cannot run away from
that responsibility.
yes, from the responsibility, and we cannot go on our lives thinking that we have nothing to do with CO2 emission.
Right. I think it's not wrong to say that industrial processes, as you mentioned,
Yes.
fossil fuel burning for energy, also deforestation.
Yes.
These are the largest contributors to climate change.
Yes.
Now, you've mentioned one example, but again, perhaps our listeners would like to know how does our daily activities contribute to carbon emission and climate change?
Right. So, okay, let's think about when we just now after we manage to when we wake up to go to the toilet. So, our major source or our major contribution to CO2 emission and thus climate change is due to the energy that we use. So every time we use this energy, we release CO2. So think about where we use the energy the most. We use the most amount of energy in the areas that we want to save energy for ourselves. So for example, I live 35 kilometers away from where I work. Right. So how do I go to work? I don't want to be walking to work, although that will not emit any CO2, but it's a lot of energy on my side. So I want to save energy. So what I do is I can choose either to take public transportation or drive a car. So either way, both will emit CO2. But how much CO2 is emitted depends on my choice. If I drive, then I will emit more CO2 compared to if I take a public transportation. The train will still emit the same amount of CO2 every day. But compare that if 10 people each drive a car, so we have 10 cars compared to these 10 people taking the train. So the amount of CO2 released by the train is shared among these 10 people. So that's just one part of CO2 emission in our daily life, the transportation. So the other part that we use a lot of energy is we cannot run away from it, but we have to acknowledge is the electricity usage. So every day, even during sleeping, we are emitting CO2. Okay, the electricity, the lights, the fan, the air conditioners, the refrigerators, washing machine, computers, everything that runs on electricity will be emitting CO2. So those are the two major sources of energy consumption that we as human beings are contributing. But another major, I think there are at least three major sources. Another major source is the food consumption. So our food, although we don't see how these foods emit CO2, but in the process of getting the food traveling into our house from the farm to the table, there are a lot of steps that involves CO2 emission. For example, if vegetable and fruits, agriculture, so agriculture will use a lot of land and emit CO2, fertilizers, the transportation of the vegetables and fruits, packaging, the plastic use, and also compared to poultry farming, the animals will also produce a lot of methane and CO2. So these are the major sources of CO2. If we one energy in electricity, the transportation and food consumption. After that is the waste that we produce. Okay, especially if we are not mindful to our consumption. So if we use excessive food more than what we can take, then sometimes we go to the supermarket and we buy lots of foods, but we didn't manage to finish everything by the expiry date. The vegetable is rotten, then we have to throw it away. The throwing away of things also contribute to CO2 emission due to somebody else have to manage that waste for us. So those are some examples.
Okay, Doctor. So essentially, what you mentioned is basically the fact that we are leaving quite a bit of carbon footprint releasing or rather contributing towards carbon emission.
Yes.
Now, I think the thing is, I think most of us have heard of the word carbon footprint. It's often mentioned, but I don't really think that many people truly understand how carbon footprint is determined.
Yeah. Yes.
So perhaps you can explain to our listeners how this is done.
Right. Okay. So it's interesting, this term carbon footprint. It's now widely used in daily life. I mean, it's quite common for people to have at least have heard of carbon footprint,
Mhm.
and also there are some new terms as well, like water footprint. So these are because these are how we measure the resources that we use, impacting in our daily activities. So carbon footprints, you can define it as the amount of carbon dioxide,
Mhm.
or if not just the carbon dioxide, the CO2 equivalent
Okay.
gases that is being emitted or being released to the atmosphere due to several factors like our activities, our consumption, the energy usage, and the waste management. So every time we do something, we can associate it with how much CO2 is released to the environment.
Mhm.
So let's take a particular example. For example, if we drink a cup of coffee in the morning, so to us it's just a cup of coffee, but to some environmentally conscious persons, they would think how much CO2 is released until I get this cup of coffee in my hand. So we need to think all the way from the how the coffee beans are sourced. So there are several factors contributing to how much CO2 is released in a cup of coffee,
Mhm.
but some factors are depending, like let's say from the coffee's origin. Where do these coffee beans come from? Whether it's locally sourced, whether it's, for example, our own kopi kedah, for example, or is it coming from Indonesia,
Mhm.
nearby neighboring country? Compare that to if we have the coffee bean coming from Colombia or Brazil, some other faraway places. So those coffee beans coming from far away will have a larger carbon footprint because they need to be transported all the way to Malaysia, and that involves energy, and every time involving energy, there will be CO2 released to the environment. So that is one factor. And then how the coffee beans are grown, how much land usage are they acquiring, and whether or not they are sustainably grown and sustainably processed. Um, so those factors contribute to the CO2 calculation into the cup of coffee bean. And then
Mhm.
when they are being packaged and transported to the supermarket and until it reaches our house, and then the beans itself, if we have our own coffee machine, for example, what kind of machine or what kind of techniques do we use to brew the coffee? Um, how much electricity do we use to brew the coffee also contribute to the CO2 emission. So for example, on average, although it varies from, depending on the various factors, but on average, one cup of coffee bean, one cup meaning 150 ml, just a small cup, I think. That cup of coffee emits about 54, 57 grams of CO2 equivalent gases.
Mhm.
So that's how we determine the carbon footprint of the things that we use. And other than that, we can also determine the carbon footprint, like I said previously, based on our a major contribution in carbon dioxide emission. For example, transportation. If we drive a car to work, let's say I drive 35 kilometers per day, and from that I can estimate how much fuel do I use,
Mhm.
how much petrol do I use for 35 kilometers per day. Then from that, I can do some Googling and calculate, okay, for every liters of petrol, how if it's burned, how much CO2 will be released. Then I can calculate that carbon footprint based on my transportation, based on my driving.
Mhm.
So other than that, let's say for energy usage, so I want to know in a month, let's say I get my electricity bill, there will be the electricity bill will report how much, how many kilowatt hours being used. That's how we bill, how many ringgits we use, right? So every kilowatt hours of electricity, they have this equivalent to CO2 emission, but that depends and varies from country to country. So fortunately nowadays a lot of information is available online. So if we Google what is the average CO2 emission for the TNB, then our Tenaga Nasional Berhad supply of electricity, because we use fossil fuel, natural gas and coal. Um, typically 1 kilowatt hour of DNB electricity will release 570 gram of CO2 equivalent gases. So I think this is one homework that the listeners and myself can do when we go home and we check our electricity bill, see how many kilowatt hours we use per month, and multiply that with how many grams of CO2 equivalent gases that we emit, and then average it out by 30 days, for example, then we know how much electricity, how much CO2 emission are we emitting in daily based on electricity.
Per household.
Per household.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And also we can, if we are really curious, if we are really calculative to see, let's say if we boil a cup of water using a kettle, so we can see the energy rating from the electrical appliances. So for example, if normal water kettle, let's say the energy rating is 1.8 kilowatt hour. And how long does it take to boil a cup of water in the kettle? For example, let's say about maybe 3 minutes. Okay, so 1.8 kilowatt times with 3 minutes and divide with 1 hour. I mean, we convert that kilowatt hour to minute to our kilowatt to hour per, just convert it from kilowatt, how long we use it, and then get in terms of kilowatt hour, and then multiply that with the CO2 equivalent. That's how much CO2 that is being released by just the act of boiling a kettle, boiling a water in a electric kettle. So everything we do, we can actually calculate the carbon footprint. It's whether we are tedious enough to do it or not. And then our food, if we like to eat imported fruits, apples from New Zealand, what are other imported fruits? Grapes from Australia,
Dates.
dates. Yes, Ramadan is coming. Dates from Saudi, for example. So all those involve transportation, and there are carbon dioxide emission associated with those food and fruits. So it's best to, as far as possible, we eat local fruits because there's less CO2 carbon footprint associated with those items.
Very interesting explanation, Doctor. I think some of our listeners may think that this is going to be making my life very difficult because I need to count the amount of carbon I release. But then I think okay, even if we don't, even if we find that calculating or determining how much our carbon footprint is maybe quite tedious or difficult for some people, at least I think we can do something about reducing our carbon footprint.
Yes.
So in your opinion, what can you share with our listeners in terms of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere? What can we do?
All right. Okay. So yes, on our individual level, there are some things that we can't really control. So for example, the carbon footprint that I mentioned just now is just based on our activities. We're not talking about the amount of CO2 that we exhale from our bodies, because that one we cannot control. We cannot stop breathing just because we don't want to emit CO2. So what do we do to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? So if I'm talking from the perspective of chemical engineering, there are several factors to avoid the CO2 from being released to the environment. So I think most of us have heard of this carbon capture.
Yes.
Carbon capture. So carbon capture, CO2 capture. So normally, typically, people will just associate carbon dioxide with carbon. Although chemistry-wise, it's not the same. Carbon is the solid, but carbon dioxide is C with CO2. But just for the sake of simplifying terms, just say carbon capture. So carbon capture from the industrial aspect, so these businesses must be held responsible in terms of limiting their CO2 release to the environment, because they are the biggest players. They have the technology. They have the technology and resources to do this. So carbon capture, some companies, they capture the CO2 from being released and they store it deep down in the sea or in the ground, in the rocks. So that is called carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and storage, CCS. Some other companies captures the carbon and purifies the captured CO2 for other users, because CO2 per se is not bad. It's not a hazardous gas. It's not poisonous. On itself, by itself, it's not a bad thing. But because of the higher concentration in the atmosphere, that makes it, it's not bad, but we human is endangered by it. So the carbon dioxide can actually be used in a lot of other applications. For example, making carbonated water, carbonated drink. So that's the fizzy drink, and making dry ice, the solid CO2, and also to be used as solvent in supercritical fluid extraction. So that's talking about from the engineering side. And for some, we can convert the captured CO2 into valuable chemicals which are not harmful. So for example, the captured CO2, instead of storing it deep down in the sea or utilizing it as it is, you can convert that excess amount of CO2 into fuel. So undergoing some chemical reaction to produce methane or methanol, or even some carbonation to produce construction materials. So that's how we can reduce CO2 in the atmosphere at an industrial level. But on our level as normal human, everyday, living our own life, so how can we reduce the amount of CO2 released to the environment? Simply saying, on our own, we don't have the technology to capture the CO2 from air. Once we release to the environment, that's it. We cannot do anything. But what we can do is to reduce or to control the amount of CO2 emission by reflecting and making a better choice. Okay, so for example, the energy usage. So now we know that the sources are transportation, energy in terms of electricity usage, and the consumption. Not just food consumption, but also the consumerism, the things that we just buy as we like it, shopping. Every time we buy something, every time we buy something that we don't need, that actually contributes to CO2 emission. Because why? We are creating demand. We are telling the businesses that we want more of this, when actually we don't really need them. We want more clothes of different types. I'm guilty of this also sometimes. So when we tell them that we need more of this, they will produce more. When they produce more, they will emit more CO2s. But when we stop doing that, when we stop succumbing to consumerism and retail therapy and impulse purchases, we are telling the businesses that we are reflecting on our choices, and we are being responsible to reduce the amount of CO2 released to the environment. And when we are aware how our choices can help to control the release of CO2 to the environment, we are sending a message to the businesses out there that look, we want the companies to be more responsible in terms of their own carbon footprint, in terms of how they manage the waste that they produce. So that's how, on our individual level, we can help to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere indirectly.
Right.
Yeah.
I was intrigued when you mentioned retail therapy.
Yes.
That's a new phrase for me, by the way.
Good for you. Yes.
In any case, you talked about businesses having to be more responsible. So, how does choosing sustainable businesses would make an impact towards reducing the effect of climate change?
Okay, so when we send a message to these businesses that, look, we want you guys to be more responsible and in terms of extracting natural compounds from the earth, not excessively. So these businesses will look back, okay, we cannot continue doing business like this. Then they will be aware that nowadays people like to buy from companies that have some responsibility to conserve the environment. So this will encourage innovation. They will try to find technologies where they can save energy in their machineries, in the processes. Maybe they will streamline their processes from, let's say, using 5 different equipments for a job, to finding new technologies and innovation to reduce the process and also save energy, and that will drive the reduction in CO2 released to the environment, reduction in the carbon footprint that the company has. And then also we are supporting social responsibility of the companies, because this is the only earth that we have, and on ourselves we don't have much power. But if a lot more of us is aware that businesses must be responsible, then this will encourage them to also take this responsibility. Then we send a message to the market by not just being good to the environment by reducing the carbon footprint, but also in terms of how they treat their workers, how they source for the raw material. So I think there's a lot of debate and issues with how palm oil is being debated, whether or not it's sustainable, whether or not it's bad for the environment. So that will, so it, due to that kind of debate, it helps us, Malaysia, as one of the largest producer of palm oil, to relook at how we can make our palm oil estate and farming and processing more sustainable and environmentally friendly. Not just to be good to the environment, but also it's good for the pocket of the business as well. Yes.
So, what are the effects of climate change towards human lives?
So yes, sometimes people think. I mean, I used to think like that. That it doesn't really impact me on a personal level. I don't really have much to do, but eventually, as you can see from now, there are changing weather patterns, precipitation patterns. Like you can't predict the weather like you used to be able to, the flood. So climate change has a range of impacts on human lives, not just the weather, not just being hot or being cold. So when the weather is not stable, then it impacts the precipitation patterns. You can have more often flash floods and floods that are uncontrollable that you don't see before, like the impacts. And then when that happens, some cities will become unlivable. So I will leave this discussion to those with more expertise in urban planning and whatnot. But we can start to see that some of our some parts of the world are becoming more unlivable due to sinking cities, due to erosion of the beaches, due to climate change. What drives climate change? The CO2 emissions. So these are kind of impacts that we can see directly, and not only in terms of weather. Climate change also impacts our life in terms of health. Okay, and when you have increasing temperature, it's hotter, then it's easier to breed mosquitoes. Then we can easily get dengue, for example. So it impacts our health. And let's say if we encourage deforestation, if we don't control deforestation, then we also increase the health impact dangers in terms of zoonotic diseases. You know, so these wildlife, they have no boundary with humans anymore. They have lost their habitat, and thus we are living closely to them, and it's easier for the diseases from wildlife to spread to human. Thus the zoonotic diseases, and we start to see the during the COVID, because some theory says that it comes from wildlife. So it can it can be worse if we don't control the impact of climate change. And also, I think if we can relate to the previous topic, agriculture, then it impacts food security as well. Because climate change, agriculture, food security, all related. And eventually, if all this happens, the lack of livable cities, the lack of, the health crisis, the food security crisis, that will eventually impact our economy and national security, because people don't feel safe anymore. People are living in a lot of diseases and not enough food. So political tension, national security, that will eventually become a threat, like what we see in the movies when we don't have things controlled.
Okay, Doctor, we are coming towards the end of our program. Perhaps you have some concluding remarks?
Right. So I think for today, my aim is to share some awareness about how our choices, our lifestyle actually has a lot to do with the amount of CO2 released to the atmosphere. So I hope from this we can know how to at least determine the carbon footprint from our daily activities, mainly transportation, energy, and consumption. So I think what the best we can do at our personal level to reduce is to reduce the energy consumption and to reduce the things that we buy and avoid waste. I think Ramadan is coming, so hopefully we'll not be tempted to buy more food than we can eat in a day. So I think because all that will contribute to CO2 emissions. So I think the take-home message is to reduce energy consumption, reduce our waste produced, then we will help to reduce the CO2 emission.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Hani Farzana binti Hizadin, Senior Lecturer, Department of Chemical Engineering, Faculty of Engineering, University Malaya, for joining me in the last half an hour in our program Man and Nature. She has shared her thoughts and views and also have given some tips regarding carbon emissions, what role we can play, especially when it comes to consumption and consumerism. I think those are very important points. I'm sure that our discussion on understanding carbon emission in our daily activities has been informative and beneficial to our listeners, inshallah. To all our listeners, Man and Nature can be followed either on Radio IKIM or on IKIM FM's Facebook page. Please share and please forward this discussion with everyone so that its benefits can be more widespread, inshallah. Thank you again, Dr. Hani, for gracing to this program.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's all the time that we have for this week's edition of Man and Nature. Next week will be our last episode of Man and Nature for the season of 2023. Inshallah, we will be wrapping up our season-long discussions on issues pertaining to disasters and climate change with a very special guest. To find out, please tune in next week at the same time on Radio IKIM. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.